Hello and welcome to Sex Ed for Adults. I am Jessica Ross, a sex therapist and educator in Sterling Heights, Michigan. I'm the owner of JR Counseling, a sexual and mental health clinic, again here in Michigan. And so this segment today is going to feature Tasha. I love Tasha. She's amazing. She's an amazing clinician and colleague. But I'm going to go over and read her bio, tell you a little bit about her and why I have her here. And, sex ed with adults is all about the intersection. And so we'll talk about what intersection we're at today. So Tasha Turner Freeman. Tasha is passionate about education and educating the community on the connection between mental and physical health. Professional passions often grow from personal experiences. Though she has had her share of adversity, she considers her greatest gift to be sharing all that she has learned about transforming hurt to growth, pain to healing, and victimization to advocacy. It is her goal to bring awareness and practical skills to non-clinical populations because it is her belief, that while we cannot all be therapists, we can all be therapeutic. I love that. I think that is a beautiful way of bridging, right, clinical and non-clinical. But let's talk a little bit about Tasha's experience. She's a trained sociologist and professional counselor, having a master's of arts in each discipline. She is a psychotherapist and independent consultant, specializing in trauma and resilience with a particular focus on child and family development. Tasha is skilled in clinical practice, research, community education, and has served in numerous capacities in the mental health and social service industry. For the past 3 years, she has developed a mental health focused community education curriculum for a regional healthcare system in Southwest Michigan. Additionally, she has served on a number of projects evaluating community needs and program effectiveness, provided care to an inpatient population ages 4 to 80, conducted transdisciplinary trauma assessments, and provided psychotherapy in private practice. Currently, she teaches courses and workshops such as Trauma 101, which is authored by her, of course, Community Resiliency Model, didactic and skills workshops, and other mental health awareness courses as needed. And of course, she is my lovely soror. I cannot mention that or not fail to mention that. And so welcome, Tasha, to Sex Ed for Adults.
I'm so happy to be here.
All
Thank
right, so as mentioned, I'm going to be graceful with your time because, like me, I know you have many things on your plate. And so, before we jump in, though, is there any comment that you want to make about the intersection of sexual health and trauma? Because that's what we're here to talk about today.
I mean, I would just say that I'm happy that you're discussing this topic. I think so often we kind of section off the different parts and pieces of us and we forget just how much overlap there is, whether it's with the things that we struggle with or the things that we find are going well or that help us. So I'm just grateful to have a space to be able to talk about things that overlap and, both the adversity side as well as the wellness side.
Okay, so we're going to jump right in. I'm going to ask you a question that's trauma 101 based. What is trauma?
There are so many different definitions to trauma, right? If you were to just Google it, you would come up with something from the dictionary, something from all the various trauma-related organizations. And right now, trauma-informed everything is big.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the simplest ways to understand it actually comes from one of the courses that I teach, Community Resiliency Model. And that's that trauma, we first have to understand that it is very individual. It's based on the individual's perspective. But from there, it can be easily understood as anything that's too much, too fast, okay, or too little for too long. Okay, basically something that overwhelms a person's ability to cope. Often we put in, is it life-threatening? Does it feel life-threatening to that person, right? What may seem life-threatening for me may not be the same for you. It's all about perspective. But too much, too fast, too little for too long, right? Too much hurt too fast. Too little of something you need for too long, too little love for too long, too little food for too long, right? And so it can have many different faces. but ultimately it's that overwhelming a person's ability to cope, overwhelming their resources, and happening either too quickly or for too long of a period of time.
And so if I'm hearing you correctly, it's not just that DSM textbook definition of what they're saying trauma is.
Yeah, I think, the DSM, it's a wonderful tool, but it is just that, it's a tool. And trauma, because of the fact that it is such an individual experience, it's hard to nail down and create a list. Like, here are your 25 traumatic experiences. Even within the trauma literature, there's different suggestions about different types of trauma, right? You've got things that maybe are cumulative versus, one and done situation. So it's a wide array, it's a wide range, but it's always something that we have to honor from the individual's perspective.
Okay. Well, that leads me to my next question. What is, since trauma comes in different forms and it may manifest differently in different people, what kind of response do we as people have in trauma? I specifically would like you to speak to body response, psychological response, and possibly emotional response.
Yeah. So even though trauma itself, right, the experience that is qualified as trauma is highly individual, as humans, we share some very common reactions to trauma, and they really do start at the biological level, right? And in particular, in the brain. Everything starts with the brain, starts and ends with the brain. And when I am educating people on their mental wellness, mental health, and trauma, I really want people to understand that you cannot separate your mental health from your physical health. It's all just your health. And so when we endure traumatic experience, whatever that traumatic experience is, the way that it's interpreted, the way that it's stored in our body starts first and foremost at the brain, right? Very basic level. When the brain experiences something that's interpreted as traumatic, that life-threatening, overwhelming situation, things start happening with our nervous system right off the bat, because that nervous system is what sends the signals to your body to activate things like your stress hormones, the things that get your heartbeat pumping, your blood pumping, to get your muscles moving, whether it's to prepare you to fight, to flee, or to freeze you, right? Whatever it's going to take to stay in place, that initial response. And it happens at the very basic level of the brain, which is also why oftentimes when you ask somebody why they responded in a particular way, why you jerked the car out of the way when somebody slammed on their brakes, they may not have language for that because it happened in a part of their brain that doesn't have language, right? It has sensation, but it doesn't have language. And so trauma memories then are stored in these fragments. So when we think about like triggers, oftentimes people can't tell you exactly what their triggers are. They often have to work with somebody like you and me to figure that out. And it may take them a while because again, those triggers are stored often in the form of sensation. So a smell, a temperature, a texture, a volume, a color, those things are stored in such a way that when they come out again, right, maybe the experience is over, but it happened in the winter time, it was cold and the room was pitch black. Well, that person may now have an intolerance for darkness. They may now have an intolerance for cold temperatures and they don't know why they get so agitated, right? And it triggers the mind as if they were back in that same place again, right? It's like flipping a light switch. You may not actually be in danger, but the brain doesn't know that. That's basic survival part of the brain doesn't know that. It's responding in a way that's trying to keep you, the person who's being activated, alive and safe.
And I really like that last point to bring it home is that the brain is trying to be your friend. And right, it doesn't feel good, but it really is trying to protect you. Talk to me, since we're talking about the body and physiological responses, and a lot of those responses are stored in your body, stored in your senses. Talk to me a little bit about your experience, your knowledge in terms of how that would impact sexual activity, sexual health, if you've experienced a trauma that might be sexual, but it might also not be, it might not have a sexual history related to it.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's so many things that could go with that, but remembering that, the triggers that somebody may experience can be any kind of sensation. And sex is all about sensation, right?
Mm-hmm.
Especially any kind of good sex. You have a lot of things happening physiologically when a person becomes aroused. Now, if a person has a trauma history, in particular one that's unresolved, right, meaning they haven't worked through that trauma, it's just kind of sitting and living in the body, things like increased heart rate, increased sweating, kind of that flushing feeling of being warm.
Mm-hmm.
In one instance, that might be pleasant, but if that's tied to, a trauma history and they haven't learned to detangle when it's pleasant versus when it's unpleasant, then something like sexual arousal, right, that in and of itself is not a problem. Maybe they want to engage in sex, but the things that the body starts to do in response to arousal may now somehow be tied to a trauma history. And so it takes learning and understanding of one's body of when my heart is racing fast,
Mm-hmm.
right? When is that pleasant versus unpleasant? Right? When can I tolerate that? When can I not? If my muscles are tensing, right, in preparation for action, when is that pleasant versus when is that unpleasant? Is it always the same? Is it different? Right? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. It does. It does. And one of the things that it triggered in me to think about is this idea of sometimes, especially when it's stored in the body and unresolved, that you can have a very long normal period of having sex or having interactions that are not trauma or trauma triggering, right? That you are not being responsive in that way, but that it can show up later on in a relationship and in sexual touch.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So a lot of what we know and what we talk about, and I'm going to go here because, one of the populations you serve is young children. And a lot of what I see in my practice, even, in my work across consulting, is that trauma tends to really, for some people, happen early on in life, that they have these things that impact them at very early ages. Talk to me about what that looks like and what is the evolution of trauma when you've experienced it as a child and are now an adult?
We could spend the entire day talking about what trauma does to childhood development. I would just offer to your viewers, if you haven't, if you're starting kind of at foundational knowledge, please look up the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, by Doctors Anda and Fletty. It really provides you with some solid introductory information of what does trauma do to childhood development. But in short, it impacts us, and it has the potential to impact us in many ways, right? From just kind of mental processes to your physical processes. And it can really disrupt brain development, right? And remembering that the brain is the center of it all, right? Our brain controls not only our thoughts, but then the way our body develops. And when a person experiences early childhood trauma, what we found, what the research continues to find, is that the more experiences a person has, so the more ACEs is what they're called, the more likely they are to have significant long-term health outcomes into adulthood. Right, negative health outcomes into adulthood. And that is both, again, surrounding physiological and emotional, psychological types of responses. When a person is still in childhood, right, maybe they've experienced things and maybe they've been removed from a home and they're now in foster care or group placements or something like that. What we see is that, our kids, they're trying to figure out what happened and why it happened, and their brain is trying to resolve it. And so sometimes that comes out as reenactment, in particular in kids. It can happen in adulthood too, but you see them kind of reliving their trauma story and trying to rewrite it. If you have children who've experienced sexual abuse, that can look like what is typically called that hypersexualized behavior. And then that becomes even more complicated when they get into adolescence and those hormones kick on, and sex now becomes a thing for anybody, right? Formative development, sex turns on in adolescence. You start to notice your parts and pieces, and everybody else's too. And then if you couple that with our kids who are trying to work through trauma, in particular sexual trauma, now there becomes the challenge of figuring out, okay, what is just kind of their normative sexual development and health, and what might be a sign that they're struggling with something in their history.
And I want to ask a question here. In terms of sexual trauma, because you and I have both used that term, could you share with the viewers a little bit about when we talk about sexual trauma, what exactly are we talking about? Are we just talking about penetrative violations? What are we talking about?
No, and no, not at all. When we think about, honestly, the way that I would do that is if you think about anything that could be described as sex and intimacy as an adult, think about if those happen in childhood, right? So a child experiencing that at the hands of an adult. In adulthood, when there's two consenting adults and you've got better brain functioning, you can consent and not consent, that's one thing. But a child, it's not just penetration. It can be fondling. It can even just be words. There may not even be any touch that happens, but inappropriate kinds of conversations, right? It can be viewing and seeing things that they shouldn't be seeing, that is beyond their developmental ability to understand and, again, be able to consent. So it's not just penetration. It's not just vaginal or anal penetration. It can be touch. It can be things that you see. It can be words that you hear.
I appreciate that clarification. In terms of our responsibilities as professionals, as teachers, doctors, lawyers, all these people that children and or us as adults come into contact with who have had trauma histories, or could be in position to be traumatized by what we're currently a part of, what would you say our responsibilities are?
See, Jessica, the thing is that whenever I talk to you, you get me on my soapbox. So I'm trying to not do that because we've got limited time. But I'm going to say our responsibility is to truly be trauma informed, right? And again, that's a sexy topic right now. Everybody's talking about trauma informed care. But to truly be trauma informed is more than just being trauma aware, right? A lot of well-meaning, well-intended clinicians, physicians, and other helpers that I meet say that they're trauma informed. And when I dig a little deeper, I find that they are trauma aware. They might know a definition of trauma. They might say that, they are definitely for, programming that addresses trauma and, keeping that awareness front of mind. But that does not make you trauma informed. Okay, it doesn't. True trauma informed care, if we look to SAMHSA, for example, they give us the 4 R's: realize, recognize, respond, and resist. And because I got a couple of master's degrees, I added an additional R, which is resilience. Realize, right? Realize and recognize is where most people fall. You realize that trauma is the thing. You're able to recognize maybe some signs and symptoms of it, and the people that you serve, know, and love. That's where a lot of people fall. Respond, where people like you and I live in what we do. But again, anybody can respond. You don't have to be a mental health professional, but how do we respond, whether it's through trauma-focused treatment, whether it's through our policies and practices as a non-mental health organization, but how do we create safe spaces for people? And then the resist part, resisting re-traumatizing or providing a traumatizing experience. Right. And that's where I find a lot of organizations, in particular youth organizations, haven't quite made it yet, because they realize it's a thing, they recognize it, and maybe they try to put some responses in place, but they don't fully understand how different policies, practices, and ways of being can actually re-traumatize people. Right. And there's some instances where maybe you can't get around maybe uncomfortable questions you have to ask or procedures you have to do. Right. I think about like going to the hospital. There are many things that people don't like there that could potentially be re-traumatizing. But if you're trauma informed, you're already like a step ahead of that. Like, that this thing could potentially be re-traumatizing. And so you work to make sure that the person knows you're aware and the things that you do to mitigate that harm. And then the R that I took the liberty of adding, because again, student loan debt and master's degrees, is resilience, in that we see all of these things that have happened to people. We're asking the questions of, what happened to you as opposed to what's wrong with you. But then we also are really intentional on the resilience side and asking what's right with you and what are your strengths? What can we build on? To move forward, as opposed to working from that place of deficit or brokenness or even pity, right? Like empathy and pity are not the same thing. And most people don't want pity. They want your empathy, right? They want you to walk alongside them and to also recognize what's good with them, because there's enough spaces and places that tell us that we're broken people. We don't need any more of that.
No, and and what I really love is that you push beyond this idea that no, you can have the information. What are your policies? What are your procedures? What are
Mm-hmm.
the behaviors that surround that? How do you enact that? It's not just a good bedside manner here that matters in true trauma-informed care, that it is a systematic approach to, right, how you're dealing with the people that come in. And it's from the receptionist desk to the nurse to the assistant to the principal to the counselor, that we're all involved in good trauma informed care.
Absolutely. Absolutely. What I say to people all the time is that if you people at all, right, if you
Mm-hmm.
interact with other humans, you have a role. Your word choice, the things that you say and do, the way you respond to people when they're in distress. You don't
Mm-hmm.
have to be a therapist to have to respond to people when they're in distress. And most of the time they come to us after they've already been in distress somewhere else,
Exactly.
right?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. So, how long does trauma treatment take? That's probably the number one question that people ask me. Well, how long am I going to be here?
For as long as you are willing to engage. There is no specific timeline because it goes back to that individual nature.
Mm-hmm.
For some people, they don't need a very long time. They might need maybe 6-8 sessions, and they feel like they've got it under control and they're good to go. They're like, oh, no more triggers, I can regulate, I'm good. For
Mm-hmm.
other people, and I argue for most people, it takes longer than that, and that's okay,
Mm-hmm.
because you're trying to reset your brain and your body and understanding things at a level that is outside of consciousness and awareness for anybody,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so it may take that deeper dive, but it requires you to be willing to take that dive, and it might start by just putting your big toe in the shallow end, and you might not get to the diving board for a little while, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the important part is that you stick with it. If you go in with the mindset of, okay, I got 10 sessions to get this in and get it done, I'm gonna be honest with you, you might be setting yourself up for a little bit of disappointment because you might not be done yet.
Mm-hmm.
But what you want to do is shop around, find that good clinician for you that you feel like can walk that journey with you, no matter how long it is. So that way you're not dreading like, okay, I got this Wednesday at 4:00, I'm tired of going here.
Mm-hmm.
But that it actually becomes a part of who you are, and growing and getting to that person that you want to be.
Yeah. Well, and I like the piece where I like all of it, but the piece where you said find the right clinician for you. Because what I find is that, people are, well, I've already tried somebody. I don't want to try again. I've already had an experience. And the truth is therapy is like, and tell me if you agree, kind of finding the right pair of jeans, right, that fits you just right, is that you have to be willing to look. And sometimes that look is going to be difficult and painful, in order to find the person that's appropriate for you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So in terms of, you go through treatment. Part of treatment, in my opinion, is to create a new healthy narrative in terms of sex, sexuality, and touch. Talk to me a little bit about, what that might look like, after going through trauma treatment. How do you help people create those narratives?
So, and again, for me, I practice from a very body-based perspective. So, for me, it all goes back to those sensations. A person coming back in touch with themselves. Oftentimes when people experience trauma, they kind of feel detached from their body. It's a way of the brain protecting yourself, right? Because if this part of me is hurting or feels unsafe, then my mind kind of flies away from it. So that way I can be safe. But it's reattaching to the body, having safety inside of the body, and then being able to, again, tell the difference between those pleasant and unpleasant sensations, right? When am I safe? When am I not safe? Having then the voice to be able to express, like, I feel safe right now, or I don't feel safe right now. And being able to stand firm in that. I think that there can inadvertently be a lot of like shame when people feel like they're not performing sexually in the way that they want to. But when that is happening, being able to have your voice is so important. And I would argue, just because of what I do, even more so when you're dealing with trauma, like having that partner relationship where you can express what's happening for you, where your partner can respect your boundaries as you're working through things, and then coming into safety in your body, right? And knowing when the elevated heart rate and the pumping blood and the warmed face is maybe pleasant versus when it's not, when you need to stop and when you can keep going, and knowing that it's a process. There might, Wednesday it might feel good and Sunday it might not, and that's okay. Because again, it's not like okay, if I have sex 10 times and it feels good, then it's always gonna feel good forever. It may not happen.
I'm going to push on semantics a little bit here, because you use the term feel safe. And I know a lot of what we talk about in trauma work is feeling safe versus being safe. Can you make that distinguishment for me?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So let me see how I want to say this. So I often don't even use feel too much, which is kind of funny that you would bring it out, because when we talk about feeling, right, it's often a mix of our experience emotionally and our experience through sensation. So if I say, hey, Jess, how you doing today? You might say, I'm just over the top. I'm so happy today. My husband did this wonderful, amazing thing. And then you start talking about the butterflies you got in your stomach and you were smiling so hard, your cheeks hurt. That's a mixture of sensation and emotion, right? And being able to recognize when that's something that you want to continue versus when you don't. Part of that is also kind of being able to be grounded in the present, right? So if I am actually safe, that relates to where am I in my space and time right now. I may not, quote unquote, feel safe if my brain is functioning either in the past or in the future. So it's being able to, I would say, bring those two things together. Can I feel safe while I am actually physically being safe? That's kind of the best way that I can think to put it together right now.
No, I thank you for that bridge. I just, I think it's an important thing to distinguish, right? Because we get people who use those statements and they'll say, well, I don't feel safe. Well, then sometimes the follow-up question is, are you safe?
Are you safe? Yeah, so I'll do that with people sometimes, like in this moment, right now, in these seconds, not in 5 minutes when you leave the office, not the hour before you got here, but are you actually safe in this chair, in this room right now? And sometimes people will push back and, well, I mean, I don't know. Am I? Like, I don't know. Are you? And having to think through being in the moment. And I think that's truly part of the trauma process, is because our brains will get stuck in the past of what happened and fear or worry about what did happen, or fear or worry about what could happen. And we miss what is actually happening in this moment.
I appreciate that. So how do we go about then providing appropriate sex education, body education, pre and post trauma? So for people who may, children who never experienced trauma versus someone who might have.
I mean, I think just with sex ed in general, just sex in general, we have to really remove the stigma of just talking about it. I mean, sex is part of the natural human experience, right? It lives at the very base of the brain. You got fight, flight, freeze, and the other F for reproduction. Like, it's just part of natural human development. So even just creating spaces where talking about it is normalized, whatever part. Even if it's just general, like arousal, because that is what's going to create this space for talking about things that maybe aren't so normative, or the things that are hurtful and painful. If we can't talk about just kind of the foundational experiences, the normative experiences, how could we ever possibly talk about the things that are hurtful and harmful then? We have nothing to relate it to. People think that talking about sex is going to make children go off and have all the sex. Like, that's not how this works, right? No. Like, just talking about sex isn't gonna, make somebody sex crazed. Just like, and this might upset some people, but just talking about homosexuality doesn't make someone gay. Like, there's a difference between providing knowledge and foundation. And frankly, in the world that we live in, if you don't talk about it in your safe spaces, in your family, in your social groups and what have you, children in particular, they're going to hear about it from somewhere.
Yes, they
Right. The
are.
media it's out in every platform of media. And so if we don't create safe spaces for talking about it, in particular in our homes and our own social groups, they're going to be educated somewhere else. And they may not be educated in the best kind of way. When you talk about kids who have experienced sexual trauma, then, having and knowing what is normative sexual development, and when maybe they may be showing some signs of something that replay that we talked about, or that kind of trying to resolve old trauma, or a lot of people worry about children who have been victims and turning into perpetrators. Well, I'd argue that a lot of that comes out of this hush hush shame, not talking about it. When those children come into adolescence and they start exploring their sexuality, then demonizing those children, calling them names like predators, like, you have to be able to separate normal childhood development from, maybe something that shows signs of trauma that needs addressing, and addressing in a caring and empathic way, as opposed to a shaming way, because that's never going to be the way to heal.
And if I could jump in there, right, part of what I hear you saying is sex development, sexuality is a part of normal development. Those are not things that we separate. But your recommendation for families, it sounds like, and professionals, is that there needs to be knowledge and foundation here, period, that you need to lay the groundwork.
Absolutely. And it may look different in different homes, right? I'm not saying everybody has to do it the same way. So I think about like schools, right? Where by a certain grade level, they start offering, reproductive health in schools. And so for some families, that's uncomfortable, and that's fine. But how are you addressing it? Are you addressing it at home? Right? I get it. You may not want this person who you don't really know, or, the school's curriculum providing all of the information. Fine. But what's the alternative? Because we can't play ostrich in the sand and just say, if we don't talk about it, it won't happen, because it will. And, I know most parents, they want the best for their children. They want to make sure that the morals and values of their homes, live through their children. So we have to be actively involved in that.
And I think it's important to note here that there are only 17 states in the U.S. that are required to have medically appropriate sex education. Everybody else is just putting together a curriculum, and it may be sex appropriate. I'm not saying it's not, but even in Michigan, it does not have to be medically accurate. And so we have to be mindful that, you may want to talk to your children beyond what the school is giving them, whether you're comfortable with it, or not. But I like here's what I love about what we've talked about today, that you really emphasize that there's an individualized experience, and that we have to acknowledge that each person's experience cannot be clumped into a whole, even if there may be similar symptomatic responses or somatic responses in the body, that then does not mean, right, everyone is the same. And so I think that's the emphasis here. So we are going to prepare to wrap up, but in wrapping up, I always ask 2 bonus questions. And so these questions are more of a targeted personal clinical nature. And so the first question is, you are a clinician by trade, by practice. Your focus has been working with children, working with different populations in terms of socioeconomic background, ethnicity. So talk to me a little bit about, how do you deal with your own family when it comes to conversations around sex and trauma? Because I think that people think as therapists, right, our world must be like amazing and we have all these tools, right? And so how do you deal with your own personal family?
If my 14-year-old was here, I'd probably pull her in and have her answer it for you. I really try to be mindful of what I say to other people, to make sure that it's something I can practice myself. And every once in a while, I'm not going to claim to always get it right. Sometimes I'll be in a session with someone and we'll be working through, processes and how you do this. And I almost feel a little convicted myself, like, oh, have you done that though? And that's okay, right? I feel like parenting is as much learning on our part as it is on our kids' part. But I think, maintaining that open mindset and knowing that if it's helpful in this space, it's probably helpful over here. Our kids are we have 3 kids here, and my husband is a school counselor, so they get they get it from all kinds of angles. And so they're the ones walking around asking their friends, how do you feel today? And what's that doing for your
Right.
body? But at the same time, it's really important to also remember that my children, my family, they're not my clients, that they don't need therapists, Tasha. 99% of the time they need mom, Tasha. And just integrating those two different parts and pieces of myself. It's fun. It's interesting. But yeah.
Okay. I appreciate your candidacy. I'm all tongue tied today. All right. So our last bonus question here is, how do you talk to children or other people about pleasure? One of the things that sometimes happens with trauma is that, anhedonia will come up, or a lack of ability to experience or want to experience pleasure in the body, especially as it pertains to sex. The other part of that question is that when we teach our children about sex, we don't teach them about pleasure. And eventually they're going to grow up, and you don't want your children to have unpleasant sex, right? Although we also don't want to necessarily always think about our children having pleasurable sex someday, right? So, but how do you navigate those lines when it comes to talking about pleasure?
Yeah. So just to the first part of the question, I think that goes back to this idea of reconnecting to the body. Oftentimes when people tell me that they either don't want to or can't experience pleasure, is because they've really numbed out any kind of sensational experience, because they haven't found a way to cope with those unpleasant. And it becomes almost unpredictable of when their sensations are kind of going to run away with them. And so it's safer, right, to experience nothing. And through the work that we can do together is reconnecting to that body, figuring out what's pleasant, unpleasant, and even just neutral, because neutral is not numb. So that way then they can start to re-experience pleasure, while at the same time being able to tolerate displeasure, that not everything is going to be an orgasmic experience, right? Not every sensation in the body is going to, leave you jumping for joy, but there has to be a tolerance for displeasure, and also being able to reconnect to pleasure in a way that both is safe and feels safe. When it comes to talking to our kids, I think everything can be done. Any topic can be covered at an age appropriate level. Even before we start talking in terms of sexual pleasure, just allowing our kids to have and develop language around what they like and what they don't like. Bringing their attention to the things that they like and they don't like. Consent. Consent starts before we start talking about sex, right? With my own kids, for example, I don't force them to hug and kiss anybody. Allowing them to have say over their bodies is the very, very beginning of developing adults that can then understand consent, whether it's their own or someone else's, that can understand what their body needs and wants versus someone else's, and those healthy boundaries of being able to say, like, no, thank you, or maybe you want it and somebody else doesn't, and that can be okay, right? I think that's truly the foundation.
Yes, absolutely. I'm all for that. So is sex healthy?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
All right, so we are going to get ready to wrap. If you could give us your wrap-up sentence, and then how would people follow you if they wanted information, if they wanted, to be able to learn more about what it is that you do?
Yeah, my wrap-up sentence. My wrap-up sentence is the one that I use all the time, and I think it is even more important now as we think about post-COVID-19, as we think about Black Lives Matter and all the things in civil unrest, is that where there is breath, there is hope. So oftentimes we can feel overwhelmed by whatever adversity we're facing, whether it's as individuals or communities, and we can feel hopeless. But as long as you are here, in this space, regardless of what the space looks like in 5 minutes or yesterday, that there is hope. The brain can change, the body can change, and therefore all the systems and things that we act upon can change. And that was definitely more than a sentence. I am on LinkedIn as, myself, Tasha Turner Freeman. You can find me there. You can find me on Facebook. I actually just started a new Facebook page, so content is coming, but under Dynamic Uplift. And you'll see my face there. And those are probably the best ways. I got to redo my Instagram, got locked out. Apparently that makes me old according to my child, but I'll figure it out. But you can find me those places the most regularly.
All right. Well, we appreciate you being here on Sex Ed for Adults, and we will close out. Thank you.